Not all Pokemon are created equal. Some Pokemon are designed to be strong, while others remain weak and powerless in their face. Some Pokemon reside in the Uber's tier to look down on the mere mortal Pokemon in the tiers below. However, there are some key differences between Pokemon even in these tiers that can distinguish them from among their peers. And these Pokemon have been blessed with exceptional qualities that make them very useful generally and in the long term. And I want to talk about those Pokemon today. I'm going to term these Pokemon as being perfect or just about near as perfect as you can get. And I have a few criteria for what I'm going to define as a perfect Pokemon. The first and one of the more obvious criteria would be the typing of the Pokemon. Does this Pokemon have a good typing? Something that makes it stand out and that maybe is one of the superior combinations in Pokemon. The next I want to talk about is the moves. What moves does this Pokemon get? Now, the moves, of course, depend on the base power of the move. So, for example, Kartana gets a decent number of moves, but they all are quite weak. And so Kartana is hindered by that. Therefore, I would say that's a Pokemon that could be better, right? If you gave Kartana close combat, and if you gave it Power Whip, well, Kartana might be even better than it is now, and then it would have even more tools to succeed. And there's nothing, and then at that point, it would be a perfect Pokemon because there would be nothing more that you could give it. But at the moment, Kartana is being held back. So that would be an example of an imperfect Pokemon. It's a very good Pokemon, but it's a Pokemon that could have more. Another part of moves would be the accuracy of the moves. So, for example, are there Pokemon that rely on very inaccurate moves? This, of course, would be a great hindrance to them if they're trying to be a reliable Pokemon that you can bring into a serious tournament game and not have to rely on getting hacked. So, certain Pokemon have moves or a moveset that is preferred that tends to be very accurate. And this, of course, would be something to consider when defining or trying to figure out which Pokemon are the most perfect. Next up, I want to talk about utility. Pokemon has a certain use, and that's why you put it on their team. And do you put this Pokemon on your team every once in a while, or can it just go on every team because it's just that good of a Pokemon? Now, depending on certain metagames, certain Pokemon will be more or less preferred, but there are certain Pokemon that are just so good, they're always going to be on teams, no matter which generation it is. And that really is telling of which Pokemon are perfect. And similar to that, I want to talk about Pokemon's longevity. How often is it able to be used in a metagame? Is it able to be used over multiple generations? That's the kind of things we want to look at when thinking about, is a Pokemon going to be perfect? So without further ado, let's get into the list. At number 10, we're going to start us off with Swampert. Swampert is the water ground type that was introduced in Generation 3. It was not the first water ground type. Of course, that would be Quagsire. But Swampert was the first starter and only starter to do so. And I would say Swampert stands above the other water ground types, in my opinion. Now, there are 4 water ground types that all see usage, and they all have their own redeeming qualities. Quagsire, of course, has Unaware, and that makes it very useful, especially on stall teams. However, Quagsire doesn't really shine beyond its Unaware. It does have Toxic and Recover, so it has longevity, which is something that Swampert does not have, and the ability to stall out its opponents. But it doesn't get other moves that Swampert finds useful, such as Flip Turn, and it doesn't have quite as much in terms of base stats. Now, Gastrodon also gets recovery moves, and it has Storm Drain, which is quite useful, and Swampert's ability, Torrent, isn't always useful, but Damp does prove useful on occasion. And Swampert has, again, Flip Turn, which I would say, especially in this generation, has one of the more useful qualities to it. Swampert also has a higher speed stat, which I think is very useful, especially because if you think about it, what does Swampert want to be able to check? It wants to be able to check things like Heatran. Heatran, if you can outspeed certain variants depending on the metagame, that's important. If you want to be able to flip turn out, that's important. Being able to have Ice Beam or Ice Punch to check things like Dragonite or Salamence or whatever wants to come in on you to try to set up, that's also extremely important. Of course, you have Toxic and you have Stealth Rock, and both of those are going to add to Swampert's utility. And of course, all the water grounds distinguish themselves in their own ways. But I think that even though Swampert doesn't have recovery, and that would be the one thing that it needs to be perfect, it does get many other traits that give it the most versatility. Right? It has enough speed to be able to use that option. It has enough special attack to be passable. It has a good attack stat. It has good, solid mixed defenses, so it can be physically or especially defensive depending on the occasion. And that versatility is really what makes Swampert one of the most perfect water ground types out there. But like I said, it doesn't have recovery, and that is the reason why it's only at number 10. At number 9, we have another bulky water type. We have Toxapex. And Toxapex might be a Pokemon that you would have expected to have higher up on this list, but the Pokemon higher up on this list generally are even more superb than Toxapex in my opinion. Toxapex, of course, is quite bulky, and ever since Generation 7 when it came out, it has been stalling all sorts of Pokemon on both the physically and especially defensive side of the spectrum. But generally, I feel like tends to run a more physically bulky set. Not only is that how its stat line skews, but also the Pokemon that generally Toxapex has the typing to resist generally are running a more physically oriented set. For instance, Toxapex poison type and fighting types, which poison resists, are usually physical, so you're going to want to run a physically defensive set. And that is one of the first key reasons why Toxapex is the perfect Pokemon. Something like Tentacruel, which is more specially defensive water poison, that typing doesn't match the stats because you want to resist the fighting types, which are mostly physical, and you're going to be weak to the psychic types, which are mostly special. So you don't care about that quite as much, right? And you're going to be weak to the electric types, which are also special. Now you're weak to the ground types, and that's the one where you have to be careful, but you do have some physical bulk. And with Scald, you can burn those physical attackers. So really, Toxapex has the perfect typing for what it wants to do. Scald, again, allows you to be even bulkier on the physical side, because if you can burn your opponent, then they can't really touch you at that point. It gets Haze, so it can't be stalled out, as well as Toxic. It gets Toxic Spikes for the occasions where it wants that, and it gets Baneful Bunker, although that generally doesn't see too much usage. And you do get Knockoff as well, which is always quite nice. Now, Toxapex doesn't have every move in the game, so, no flip turn for you, but I don't think many people would expect Toxapex to get that move. I think it would be really annoying if it got it, to the point where some people might consider a suspect test for it. But Toxapex overall has just about everything that it needs to succeed. And the final point, of course, we have to consider is Toxapex's ability Regenerator. And there are many Regenerator Pokemon that could make this list potentially, but I think that Toxapex is the Regenerator that stands out among the rest. Many other Regenerator Pokemon have weaknesses. For example, Tornadus has shoddy accuracy. Tangrowth has only one typing, and so as a result doesn't get multiple stab options, and has a pretty bad F stat. And Slowking, Slowbro can be good in specific metagames, but a struggle in different metagames depending on what is being popular. But Toxapex almost invariably can succeed in any metagame, whether it be stally, offensive, just because it has the stats and the typing and the moves to be able to take that metagame on, no matter what. Okay, next up we've got Gliscor. And Gliscor is a flying and ground type. And that flying ground type is something that you'll probably see later up on this list as well. It's a great typing because you're immune to both ground, which every team wants to have an immunity to ground, and you are a ground type yourself, giving you an immunity to electric, which is extremely important for a team to have. Now, this does leave you 4 times weak to ice, but as long as you know that's coming, this isn't really that big of a deal. And Gliscor is so bulky that even weaker hidden power ices in previous generations weren't that big of a deal for Gliscor. It could stall those out. One of the things that makes Gliscor superior to so many other Pokemon is its hidden ability Poison Heal, which allows it to get poisoned and then heal a lot of HP at the end of each turn. Now, not only did this act as a built-in leftovers, but it prevents Gliscor from getting statused by other Pokemon during the game. So it can't get paralyzed, it can't get burned, it can't get put to sleep. So Gliscor becomes a very effective status absorber. And of course it's toxic, but that is what you want because that's healing you. Now, you're healing 1/8 of your max HP, which is more than 1/16, so it's a good chunk of HP to be healing every turn. Once you get knocked off, it doesn't matter as long as you don't have any heal bell on your team, because you'll remain poisoned. So as opposed to many other leftovers Pokemon that get knocked off, Gliscor doesn't care about getting knocked off, so it becomes a very good knockoff absorber. Also, it becomes a good trick absorber because nobody wants to trick a Toxic Orb to themselves. So as long as you don't play with your Gliscor too recklessly and bring it in on a Scald before it's gotten the chance to get his Toxic Orb activated, Gliscor has that utility. You get a knockoff and trick absorber, to be a good status sponge, and to have that reliable recovery that you can't remove from the opponent. Gliscor also has a very, very strong move pool. You've got Earthquake, you've got Roost, of course. You've got Acrobatics if you technically need it. And then you've got Fire Fang, which is also quite useful. Knockoff is the big one, of course. Everybody wants to have knockoff. And you've got Swords Dance Facade sets. And then you've got Toxic and Taunt. So you can run so many moves that Gliscor is often burdened by which 4 it wants to bring, right? It's spoiled for choice. Gliscor sometimes even wants to run U-turn or momentum, but if you run U-turn, you're going to give up something else. And there's so many options that Gliscor can run, so that no matter what kind of metagame we're running, there's no reason not to try Gliscor out, right? It can even be a defogger for your team if that's something that you require. So Gliscor has so many different options going for it, and with its typing being such that it is, with all its key resistances and immunities, it becomes very difficult to KO. So even though Gliscor's stats overall aren't stellar, right? 75 HP isn't great, and 75 SpDef isn't fantastic, 95 speed's fine. Nothing to write home about though. Right? Nothing stands out for Gliscor stat-wise, but all around that package comes together to create something that becomes extremely annoying for teams to deal with. And so Gliscor can check a lot of Pokemon and gives a team a lot of utility, which is exactly what you want as a Pokemon. And the next Pokemon is a little bit similar to Gliscor. We've got Scizor up next. And Scizor has those same claw hands, which is why I think of them as being similar. But in addition to that, it also is a Pokemon that has Swords Dance, Roost, Recovery, has U-turn, of course, for momentum. This time U-turn is Stab. But the main thing is that Scizor can act as an offensive Pokemon, it can act as a defensive Pokemon, it can be bulky on either the physical or the special side, and it has key resistances and immunities. Scizor, of course, is a good psychic answer in a lot of instances because of that steel typing and the super effective bug U-turn. It got the ability to be immune to poison, which is very useful as a defogger, for example. If you want to remove toxic spikes, then Scizor is a very good option for that. And the other main thing that Scizor does is it runs Bullet Punch. Bullet Punch is, I guess, the one thing that is different from Gliscor, in that Scizor gets priority moves and Gliscor doesn't. But the priority moves are Scizor's bread and butter. Most of the time, if not every single time, Scizor is going to be running Technician, and so Technician Bullet Punch becomes quite powerful after the stab boost. You can also run Sword Stand Quick Attack, which is maybe not as effective in most situations, but does give you situational scariness that people will have to respect. You get Knockoff, Toxic, just all sorts of really annoying moves that in different situations can be useful. So once again, we have a Pokemon that's very versatile, and in a particular metagame, it can do really well. Now, sometimes Scizor doesn't perform well in the OU tier, and it falls down to UU, but I don't necessarily think that a Pokemon that is UU is bad at doing its job. I just think that perhaps the Pokemon that are in the metagame above are going to punish this Pokemon. For example, Scizor. It's 4 times weak to fire. Now, of course, if I know that my opponent has a fire move, I will switch out. But what happens when the metagame becomes dominated by Pokemon that have access to fire-type moves? Of course, you got that in every generation, but I feel like there are certain generations where there are just too many of them, and that may be what's currently happening in Gen 8 OU. Alright, Landorus Therian. Now, Landorus is a Pokemon that I think a lot of people would have expected to see on this list. Landorus, of course, has that same ground flying type as Gliscor. It's very powerful typing, got those key immunities like we talked about. And Landorus comes with the Intimidate ability. Intimidate ability, of course, is quite good because you get extra bulk for your trouble. Right? Gliscor has to invest in his defensive stat in order to become physically tanky. But Landorus doesn't have to do that. In fact, right now, most Landorus are running a more especially defensive set, but they never need to run a physically defensive set, really, because they already intimidate you when they come in, so there's not really much need to do so. But similar to many of the Pokemon previously seen on this list, Landorus has a lot of utility moves. Being able to slot into a team means I need to have a lot of different options to offer. So once again, we see Knockoff, Toxic, U-turn combo that so many other Pokemon value, like Scizor and Gliscor. You have Earthquake, of course, as your main option for attacking, but you can also run Stone Edge, of course, and you can run Smackdown if you don't want to miss as hard. You've got Weather Ball in case you want to run something really cheeky, and you got Defog as even more utility options. Of course, in a Dynamax metagame, you get a flying stab on there, and all of a sudden Landorus is extremely scary. Or Z moves with Supersonic Sky Strike, right? So Landorus overall is a very powerful Pokemon that needs to be respected. It could get a flying stab, and then it would be even more problematic. But I think at that point, if Landorus got a good flying stab, something, 100 base power, or even got Brave Bird, I think that we would have a different discussion about Landorus as to whether it was too powerful and not whether it was solid Pokemon. So Landorus wants to see high OU usage, doing stuff just right. Alright, now next up we've got another bulky ground type. We've got Primal Groudon. I want to specify Primal Groudon because normal Groudon, while it is okay, doesn't really come with the same package that Primal Groudon has. Primal Groudon has a couple things going for it that normal Groudon doesn't, and has a special place in the metagame as a result. The first one is Desolate Land ability, of course. Having the ability to set up the sun is going to, or the strong sun specifically, is going to give you an immunity to water, which is crucial because now you go from having a weakness to having an immunity. This is fantastic for Primal Groudon. The second thing is that fire typing. The fire typing is both going to give it a secondary stab option, which is incredible, as well as giving it an immunity resistance to fairy. So this makes it a very good Xerneas check. And so Primal Groudon goes from just being a strong ground attacker to being a strong ground and fire attacker, and gaining a bunch of bulk and attack stat too. Right? All around, Groudon got stat increases, and I think it just makes Primal Groudon that much scarier. The Primal Groudon really doesn't need much more going for it. If you want an offensive set, you got Rock Polish. You've got special sets with Overheat and even Dragon Pulse for Ubers, because some of them are Dragon types, right? You've got Precipice Blades, of course, but if you don't want to miss, you've got Earthquake, which is always a solid option. You've got Heat Crash, of course, which is a fantastic move for Primal Groudon, one of the heaviest Pokemon. Even in the Ubers tier, Heat Crash is an interesting option. You got Eruption. So offensively, you're very, very powerful. But then you have Roar and Stealth Rock and Toxic, of course. So if you want to run a more bulky set that can phase Pokemon out, that can just mess up an opponent's day if they want to try to set up in your face, then you have that option as well. The Primal Groudon in the previous generation saw insane usage, and I don't think that there's any mistake as to why that happened, really. Being able to both offensively and defensively deal with teams means that Primal Groudon in any generation it's going to be available is going to be a standout Pokemon. Alright, at number 4 we've got Clefable. Clefable is of course a Pokemon that ever since Generation 6, upon receiving the Fairy typing, has been in OU every generation and has always been extremely annoying. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is Magic Guard. Magic Guard means that you don't take hazards, means you don't take toxic damage, means you don't take Life Orb damage, or anything else that Clefable might need to get chipped down, like Sandstorm, for instance. So Clefable overall is going to just take only real damage from attacks. And while its stat line is mediocre, the stats can be invested in such that it can take just about any one hit that it needs to. And it has the moves to counter as a result. It's got Moonblast, which is a fantastically spammable move. It's got Thunder Wave if it needs to annoy you in that way. It's got Knock Off. It's got Toxic, of course. It's got Trick as well, so it can trick you with the Sticky Barb or the Iron Ball or what have you. And then in terms of offensive presence, besides the Moonblast, it's got Flamethrower, which is a godsend for most fairy types, as well as Thunderbolt and Ice Beam. So really, what more could Clefable need? It's even got Focus Blast, and I guess if you wanted to run on doubles, you could run Dazzling Gleam as well. Although I don't see as much doubles usage. You've got more utility, of course, in Wish and Aromatherapy or Heal Bell, and you've got both offensive and defensive Clefable, right? Because Calm Mind is this weird move where you become both offensively and defensively scary. Calm Mind Clefable, extremely threatening set, and you have to be prepared for it. So Clefable is a Pokemon that in every generation always comes back, and there's definitely reasons why. The Fairy typing, an extremely good typing, and you'll probably see it more on this list. Some typings in Pokemon are just superior to others, and Fairy is the typing that is superior to all others in almost every way, because it's just so spammable and it's got very few resistances, and Moonblast specifically is just an extremely powerful and no drawback move to spam. And so Clefable, especially because of getting that Fairy typing, has just become a standout Pokemon in every generation of OU. Alright, at number 3, we've got Zacian. Now this, of course, can be either Zacian Crowned or normal Zacian. It doesn't matter. Zacian is busted. Now, Zacian, when it was first revealed and it was in the game and we could see its stats and its move pool, it was pretty obvious that this Pokemon was busted. But it took a while for people in the Ubers tier to play around with it, to realize that no, it is truly busted. And so they banned the Crowned version because the Crowned version has those increased stats. But even after doing that, people realized that normal Zacian is also still busted. Now, of course, normal Zacian has some drawbacks. For example, you don't get the secondary Steel typing. So not only do you lose your secondary Stab, but you also become weak instead of immune to poison, and you also lose the key resistances that Steel has. But Zacian Normal can still run a new item, and that new item becomes even scarier, like Choice Scarf or Choice Band. And now you have +2 attacks instead of just +1 attack on switching is the Choice Band. And so normal Zacian was almost just as scary as Zacian Crowned. Now Zacian is one of those Pokemon that's just so good, you could say, why is Zacian not at number 1? Because it was banned to double Ubers, right? To anything goes. It must be the perfect Pokemon. But I would say no. And here's the reason why. In my mind, a Pokemon that is perfect needs to be able to play competitively and fairly with other Pokemon. And Zacian is just too strong, too fast, and has too many good moves to the point where, we're not even playing the same game anymore. You just brought this cheat code to the game. Even in the Ubers tier, where all the Pokemon are legendary and most of them either show up on boxes or are the mythicals, and you're still telling me that even among those, this Pokemon is just that much more powerful than the rest of them? It's ridiculous. The speed tier is off the charts, the attack stat is unchained, and it's got really good defenses. You would have thought that Zamazenta would have good defenses and have been maybe a bit slower, and the Zacian would have been fast and would have had good offenses as well. Zacian is fast and has good offenses, but it also has 115 in both defense stat. It's really not that weak defensively, as well as Zamazenta being fast, but Zamazenta has issues, so it's not on this list. Zacian, in addition to having a crazy stat distribution, also has every single move it could possibly want, with the exception of maybe Leaf Blade. So you've got Behemoth Blade, of course, as a signature move. You've got Play Rough. That constitutes its dual stab. You've got Crunch for the ghost types, like Gengar, for instance, that would be annoying, I suppose. Or you got Crunch. Sorry, I just said Crunch. You've got Close Combat, rather. You've got Close Combat for the Steel types, which resist your dual stab. And Close Combat is the big one, I think, because, again, if I'm a Aggron, I come in, I resist your Play Rough because I'm a Steel type, and I resist Behemoth. I guess Aggron is neutral to Behemoth Blade, but get the idea. You got Psychic Fangs for the poison types, if that's a thing you're worried about. You got Sacred Sword if you don't want to take the stat drop from Close Combat. And then finally you have Wild Charge for the bulky water types, which is a really big one. And also for some flying types like Charizard and doubles. You've got Swords Dance to boost your stats even higher. Part of me says, why do you even need to boost your stats when you're already at 170 attack plus you get a +1 to your attack just from your ability? But you can if you want. You've got Quick Attacks, so they don't even skimp on the priority. You've got priority as well if that's something you need. So really the only things that Zacian could want are Leaf Blade and Earthquake. And that's about it. If it got Leaf Blade, I think it would have just been insta-banned because Quagsire wouldn't have been a check. And then people would have just given up on Zacian fitting into the metagame even quicker. Zacian is just way too good of a Pokemon. They made it way too fast, way too powerful, and its ability just immediately invalidates like 80% of the metagame on switching. So, although I think that this would be a strong contender for number 1, I don't really think it is fair to use as a Pokemon because it's just that good. And so I'm going to put it at number 3. And number 2, we've got Magearna. He's another Steel Fairy type. It's no coincidence. Steel and Fairy is one of, if not the best type combination in all of Pokemon. This, of course, is not news to most people. Most people can immediately recognize the inherent benefits of being both Steel and Fairy. They were already individually 2 of the best typings in Pokemon. When you combine them, they make one of, if not, like I said, the best typing in all of Pokemon. Now, Magearna, of course, is a special attacker, where Zacian is a physical attacker. And Magearna is quite slow compared to Zacian. But Magearna has quite good defenses and has an even more interesting ability, Soul Heart gives you a Spatak raise every time a Pokemon faints on the field. Doesn't matter if you made them faint or not, you get a special attack raise, which is fantastic. One of the reasons why this is such a strong ability is that a lot of times people will try to sack a Pokemon when you switch in your Magearna. They say, oh, well, I need to get rid of a Pokemon so I can come in and revenge kill you. Well, normally when somebody sacrifices a Pokemon, you don't get anything out of that turn. But if you sacrifice a Pokemon in front of Magearna, all of a sudden I have +1 on my special attack. So I can do whatever I want this turn and I'll still get benefit out of it at the end of the day. A very strong ability. In addition, of course, it's a snowball ability, a little like Moxie or Beast Boost, in that as you succeed in the battle, you succeed harder in the future. Because if I get one knockout, now my likelihood of getting another knockout has increased. And so Soul Heart can very easily snowball into just immediate wins for Magearna. Magearna has agility and or shift gear, which allows it to actually get fast. And the Calm Mind, Iron Defense, Stored Power, Draining Kiss set is extremely powerful. You've got the ability to hit the poison types that might resist your Draining Kiss. You've got the ability, of course, to hit the dark types with Draining Kiss that would be immune to Stored Power. And overall, you just get both recovery and Stored Power boosts at the end of the game. Magearna is extremely powerful. You can run a bulky set or an offensive set, depending with weakness policy or Sugar Berry or whatever you want. And barring that, of course, Magearna has other moves in its arsenal, like Volt Switch and Flash Cannon. The Assault Vest set was very popular both in this generation before it was banned and in the previous generation. Sometimes even you would run Iron Head. And you've also got things like Pain Split in case you need to get a form of longevity. You've got Trick Room, so the Magearna can act as an effective Pokemon on a Trick Room team, which is really nice because a lot of Trick Room teams tend to be psychic heavy, and Magearna can mitigate that somewhat. You've got utility options like Trick and Thunder Wave and Heal Bell, so you've got tons of utility. If you are worried about Focus Blast, you've got Aura Sphere, so that's something to take note of. And then, of course, you have the very powerful Flare Cannon. Flare Cannon, of course, being an extremely powerful Draco Meteor, essentially, for fairy types. And most Pokemon can't deal with Flare Cannon plus a fighting move, and Magearna has both Aura Sphere and Focus Blast, so have fun switching into Magearna if it's an offensive set. So Magearna is extremely powerful and has so many different options that it can play, as opposed to Zacian, which is just mostly an offensive Pokemon, right? Zacian comes in, hits hard, and that's the end of the story. And of course it does that extremely well, to the point of being unfair. But Magearna has the option of being both offensive and defensive, and it can be very difficult to kill. It can be very difficult to kill or to revenge kill, because if it just sets up and you allow it to get a couple of Calm Mind or Iron Defense boosts, all of a sudden, now you just can't kill it. Great. Now the game's over. So Magearna, very scary Pokemon. But at least in theory, if you play around it properly, you do have options against it, so it isn't quite as unfair as some of these other Pokemon. Alright, in the number 1 slot, we've got Yveltal. Now Yveltal is one of the best Pokemon in the Ubers tier this generation, and this isn't news. I don't think that many people who follow Pokemon are surprised to hear that Yveltal has such high usage. It's a pretty well-known fact. But it isn't just this generation that Yveltal has done well in. Yveltal did very well in its initial generation of Generation 6, and in Generation 7, Yveltal really came into its own. Initially in Generation 6, Yveltal had some struggles standing out against Xerneas. Xerneas, of course, had the fancy toy of Geomancy, and beat Yveltal just based off of type matchup. So initially, Yveltal may have struggled a little bit. But Yveltal really does have stellar utility and really good typing. And this really came to bear in Generation 7 especially, because in Generation 7 we got Lunala, Solgaleo, and the Necrozma forms, and all of those are psychic types. And Yveltal, being a dark type, really deals well with those. And so when a psychic type is causing problems, just bring in Yveltal. When a ghost type, like it is right now, is dealing problems, just bring in Yveltal. And Yveltal is an extremely effective answer to the psychic and ghost types. In addition to having dark flying typing, which is extremely good typing, it also has a couple other things going for it. First of all, Dark Aura. Dark Aura isn't the best ability in the world, technically speaking, but giving yourself a life orb boost for free on all of your dark moves is nothing to scoff at, right? You've got Knockoff, you've got Foul Play, you've got Dark Pulse, you've got Sucker Punch. All those moves in their own time can be very powerful coming off of Yveltal. And if I have an ability that boosts my power just right out the box, then I can get KOs without even investing in my attack stat. Right? Foul Play, of course, doesn't require any investment in your attack stat whatsoever. But if I want to have a really powerful Sucker Punch, well, I can invest in my attack stat if I need to, but even if I don't, it's still going to be something you're going to have to play around. It's going to be very scary. Knockoff, of course, being an extremely powerful move, and Dark Pulse, if I'm running a more tanky set, is still a solid option to spam, and I can get flinches off of that. So you've got to watch out for that. Yveltal, of course, is a Pokemon that doesn't have the most refined stat distribution. It has 131 in both attack stat and special attack stat, so it isn't necessarily geared towards one or the other. So looking at that, you would say, well, I wasted a lot of my points. But Yveltal can use both of those on different sets, and because it has the ability to run both physical or special attacker, you have to scout that out first in the battle to know which one is running. And no matter what the metagame is, if I need to run Blissies a lot in the particular metagame, well, I can just run a physical Yveltal, and all of a sudden your Blissey isn't going to be walling me. If perhaps I have more physically bulky Pokemon, I can run special Yveltal. It doesn't matter because I have good attack and special attacking stats and moves to go along with them. The defenses are not bad either, and you got a decent speed stat. Of course, for the Ubers tier, 99 speed is not great, but with Sucker Punch, you don't really need it, and a lot of times you don't even really want it, right? Yveltal has the ability to come in, take a move, force an opponent out, and then click a slow U-turn. And having a nice slow U-turn is a very valuable thing in the Ubers tier. You've got Taunt, Toxic, Knockoff. Taunt, Toxic, Knockoff is a fantastic combination. You've got that Defog, so if you need that option as well. And of course you have Roost for longevity. Overall, Yveltal has all of the utility moves you could ask for. Right? The ability to stop your opponent from doing shenanigans with Taunt means that it's going to protect itself from being statused in a lot of instances. Being able to Toxic the opponent means that it can sit and be bulky, as well as punish people who are trying to win a Sucker Punch war, especially if your Sucker Punch won't OHKO them. You've got Heat Wave and Oblivion Wing. Oblivion Wing is another big one. Heat Wave, of course, I mentioned specifically for Pokemon like Ferrothorn and maybe Genesect if that's an issue. But Oblivion Wing is, of course, Yveltal's signature move, and it not only gives him a good flying stab to spam, but also enables him to heal passively while doing damage. And this is something that's really important for a Pokemon that wants to be bulky, but also has a fantastic attack stat, because you don't want to just sit in and be fat and do nothing. But Yveltal can sit in and do damage and still be fat, still get recovery at the end of the day. And Oblivion Wing is a very strong recovery move. It's stronger than Drain Punch in the sense that it recovers back more HP. So really quite a useful move to be spamming if you can. And then with all its utility options, it's just got so many things going for it. Yveltal really doesn't struggle with very much. Now, of course, Yveltal does have a typing, and typings will always be weak to something. You're weak to Fairy, which is a common typing. You're weak to the ice types, which are quite nice to spam in OU, or in Ubers rather, with all the dragons running around. And you're weak to electric. But just because you're weak to something doesn't mean you can't mitigate that with the rest of the teammates. And with all of the utility offered to your teammates, you should be able to fit onto just about any kind of team. So if you're running a hyper-offensive team, you can run Scarf Yveltal, or a more just Sucker Punch-based Yveltal, that works. You can run Yveltal on a balanced or bulky offensive team. You can run it on even a stall team, especially because you've got things like Toxic and Taunt and Defog, right? Yveltal has so many options going for it. And I don't think that Yveltal really needs anything to be superior. Of course, you could give Yveltal things to be superior, but at this point, I don't even think Yveltal would want anything more to fit on its moves, just because it has only 4 moves that it can run, and its 4 moves are being taken up by things that are already fantastic, right? It's got to have a dark move, and it has basically all the dark moves it could want. So unless you're going to give it Hyperspace Fury, I think that it's good. And then it has a really good Oblivion Wing. It's got U-Turn, got Roost, and it's got a bevy of status and other non-attacking moves like Taunt and Encore and just about any other thing that you need. So Yveltal really is, in my mind, the perfect Pokemon. They created a Pokemon that was balanced. They created a Pokemon that has all the different options that it can run. Something for just about every team to run. And I don't think that necessarily explains why Yveltal is seeing such high usage in the Ubers tier currently. But I think that it will explain why Yveltal will continue to see usage in the Ubers tier in any generation it's allowed moving forward. Because really there's no reason why you couldn't use Yveltal. Maybe you don't feel like it, that's fine. You don't have to use Yveltal, but why not use Yveltal? It's right there, and it's got so many good moves on it that, really, Yveltal just is the perfect Pokemon.